The autumn of 1944 brought a hunger so deep, too occupied France, that people spoke of it as a living thing that stalked the streets and crept into homes and wrapped its fingers around the throats of the young and the old alike, and somewhere in the shadows of a small town near the German border, a young black woman loaded a basket with bread hidden beneath dirty laundry and prepared to walk a path that could lead to her death, and her name was Josephine Beaulieu. And she was the daughter of a Senegalese soldier who had fought for France in the First War, and a French mother who had taught her that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else mattered more. And what mattered most to Josephine was the hollow-eyed American and British prisoners she had glimpsed through the wire fence of the camp at the edge of town. She had been born in 1920 in a village in Normandy where her father had settled after the Great War, and she had grown up knowing what it meant to be different in a country that celebrated equality but did not always practice it, and her skin set her apart in a nation where most faces were pale, and she had learned early to carry herself with dignity and to meet suspicion with grace. And when the Germans came in she had watched as the world she knew crumbled around her, and the soldiers in their gray uniforms looked at her with particular contempt, because the Nazi ideology had no place for people who looked like her. The occupation transformed daily life into a continuous struggle for survival, and food became scarce as the Germans requisitioned crops and livestock, and the French people learned to make meals from scraps and weeds and hope. And Josephine worked as a seamstress, repairing uniforms and clothing for whoever could pay, and she kept her head down and her eyes open, and she waited for a chance to do something that mattered. And that chance came in the winter of 1943, when the Germans established a prisoner of war camp just outside her town, and the first skeletal figures in tattered uniforms appeared behind the barbed wire. But what happened next changed everything, because Josephine discovered that her position as a seamstress gave her access that others did not have, and the German officers needed their uniforms maintained and their torn clothing mended. And she was allowed to move through areas of the town that were restricted to ordinary citizens. And she used this freedom to observe the patterns of the guards at the prisoner camp, and she noticed that the shift change at dawn created a brief window when the fence nearest the woods was unwatched. And she began to plan. The first delivery was the most terrifying, because she did not know if the prisoners would betray her, or if the guards would catch her, or if her courage would fail at the crucial moment. And she loaded her basket with bread and cheese, and a few precious apples hidden beneath clothing she was supposedly delivering to a customer on the far side of town. And she walked through the darkness before dawn, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain the whole world could hear it. And she reached the section of fence near the woods, and she waited in the shadows. And then she saw them. The prisoners emerged from their barracks like ghosts, moving silently through the compound, and they had received word through channels. She never understood that help would come at dawn, and 3 young men approached the fence, their faces gaunt, their eyes burning with desperate hope. And Josephine pushed the food through a gap in the wire where a post had rotted, and for one moment their hands touched, and she felt the trembling of fingers that had not known kindness in months. And no words were spoken, because words were too dangerous, but everything that needed to be said passed between them in that touch. Yet she never imagined this moment would reshape her destiny, because those 3 prisoners survived the winter on the extra food she provided, and they told others. When the demand grew, and Josephine found herself at the center of a network she had never intended to create, and other women in the town began to help, and they gathered scraps and saved portions from their own meager meals, and Josephine became the one who made the deliveries, because her access as a seamstress gave her the best cover, and the prisoners called her their angel, though they never knew her name. The risks multiplied with each delivery, and the Germans grew suspicious of the prisoners, who seemed stronger than they should be, and they increased patrols and added guards, and Josephine had to change her routes and her timing, and she learned to read the movements of the soldiers and to predict their patterns, and she developed a 6th sense for danger that saved her life more than once. And she recruited watchers who would signal if a patrol was approaching, and the network grew more sophisticated, even as the danger intensified. And then something no one expected occurred in the spring of 1944, when a young German soldier caught Josephine in the act, and she stood frozen with her basket in her hands, the bread clearly visible beneath the thin layer of clothing. And the soldier raised his rifle, and time seemed to stop, and Josephine prepared to die. And then the soldier lowered his weapon and looked at her with eyes that held no hatred, only a terrible weariness, and he said in broken French that he too had a mother who would do anything to save a life. and he turned and walked away, and Josephine stood trembling as the dawn light grew stronger, and she realized that even in the midst of horror there were moments of unexpected grace. The prisoner camp held men from many nations, but the largest group was American, and they were aviators mostly, whose planes had been shot down over occupied Europe, and they had been captured and transported from camp to camp until they ended up in this small French town, waiting for a war to end. And among them was a young lieutenant from Alabama named James Mitchell, who had been a prisoner for 2 years, and who had watched friends die of starvation and disease and despair, and when the food began arriving at dawn, he felt something he had almost forgotten how to feel, and that something was hope. Behind these ruins a secret waited, because Josephine was not only bringing food, and she was also carrying messages, and the prisoners began to pass her information about German troop movements and supply routes and anything they could observe from their position, and Josephine would memorize the details and pass them on to resistance contacts, who relayed them to London, and the intelligence she gathered contributed to the planning for the Allied invasion that would come in June of 1944, and she never knew the full importance of what she did, but she knew that every message might save lives. The summer of 1944 brought the sound of distant thunder. There was not thunder at all, but the guns of liberation, and the D-Day invasion transformed the war, and suddenly the Germans were no longer conquerors but a retreating army, and the occupation that had seemed permanent began to crumble, and Josephine watched as the soldiers in gray grew nervous and hurried, and she continued her deliveries, even as the danger increased, because the starving men behind the wire needed her now more than ever, and the chaos of the German retreat created new opportunities and new perils. What she discovered next would shake even her commanders, because in August of 1944, as the Allied forces pushed across France, the Germans received orders to evacuate the prisoner camp and move the prisoners east to Germany, and Josephine learned of this plan from a sympathetic German clerk who had helped her before. And she knew that many of the weakened prisoners would not survive the forced march, and she had to act, and she contacted the resistance. And a plan was formed that was either brilliant or suicidal, and perhaps both. The liberation of the camp happened on a night in late August, when the summer heat still clung to the land, and the stars were hidden by clouds, and Josephine led a group of resistance fighters through the woods to the section of fence she knew so well, and the guards were fewer now, many having been pulled away to fight the advancing Allies, and the prisoners had been told to be ready, and when the signal came, they rushed the fence as the resistance fighters cut the wire, and German shouts filled the air and gunfire erupted in the darkness. Josephine ran through the chaos, helping prisoners who could barely walk, and pointing the way to the forest, where guides waited to lead them to safety, and bullets sang past her head, and she heard the screams of men being hit, and she kept moving because stopping meant dying, and she found Lieutenant Mitchell collapsed against a tree, too weak to continue, and she pulled his arm over his shoulder in half, carried him into the woods, and they stumbled through the darkness together until they reached the rendezvous point where trucks waited to take them south. The journey to the Allied lines took 3 days through territory that was still contested, and they hid in barns and cellars during the day and moved at night, and Josephine tended to the wounded with whatever supplies she could find, and she held the hands of 2 men who died despite her efforts, and she buried them in unmarked graves and said prayers over the fresh earth, and she kept leading the survivors south, because there was nothing else to do but keep going, and finally, on the morning of the 4th day, they heard American voices and saw American uniforms, and the war was over for them at last. The liberation of France brought celebration and chaos in equal measure, and old scores were settled, and collaborators were punished, and heroes emerged from the shadows. And Josephine returned to her town to find it transformed, and the people who had kept their heads down during the occupation now claimed to have been resistors all along. And she said nothing because she had not done what she did for recognition, and the prisoners she had saved scattered to hospitals, and eventually to their home countries. And she thought she would never see any of them again. But Lieutenant Mitchell had not forgotten, and when he recovered enough to travel, he returned to the small French town where he had been imprisoned, and he asked everyone he met about the black woman who had brought food to the prisoners, and finally someone told him where to find Josephine, and he walked up the path to her small house and knocked on the door, and when she opened it he fell to his knees and wept, and he told her that she had saved his life and the lives of dozens of others, and that he would spend the rest of his days making sure the world knew what she had done. The end of the war brought a strange kind of quiet, and Josephine tried to return to her life as a seamstress, but the memories would not let her rest, and she dreamed of the faces behind the wire and the sound of gunfire and the weight of Lieutenant Mitchell leaning on her shoulder, and she wondered if what she had done mattered, and if the world would ever change, and if the hatred she had seen would ever truly be defeated. And she had no answers, only the knowledge that she had done what her conscience demanded. The years passed, and France rebuilt itself, and the scars of occupation slowly faded into the landscape, and Josephine married a man who had also served in the resistance, and they raised children and grew old together, and she told her children stories of the war, though she left out the parts that still made her wake screaming in the night. And her husband understood because he too carried memories that could not be spoken, and together they built a life that honored the past while reaching toward the future. Lieutenant Mitchell kept his promise, and he wrote letters and contacted historians and gathered testimonies from the prisoners who had survived, and slowly the story of the black woman who smuggled food through the wire became known. And in 1965, 20 years after the end of the war, the French government contacted Josephine and informed her that she would receive the Croix de Guerre for her service to France, and she wore her best dress to the ceremony, and her children sat in the front row, and she thought of all the people who had not lived to see this day. The American government followed in 1972 with a commendation that recognized her contributions to the survival of American prisoners of war, and Lieutenant Mitchell, now a retired colonel, flew across the Atlantic to present the award, and he was an old man by then with white hair and a cane, but his eyes were the same eyes that had looked at her through the wire all those years ago, and they embraced, and there were no words that could contain what passed between them, but words were not necessary. Josephine lived to see the end of the 20th century, and she watched as the world changed in ways she could never have imagined. And she saw progress and setbacks and moments of hope and despair, and she never stopped believing that ordinary people could change history through acts of courage and compassion. And she told her grandchildren that fear was natural, but that fear should never have the final word. And they listened with wide eyes, not fully understanding but sensing that their grandmother had touched something eternal. She passed away in 2003 at the age of 83, and the funeral was attended by diplomats and veterans and ordinary citizens who had heard her story, and the French flag and the American flag both flew at half-staff in her small town, and her coffin was carried by men who wore the medals of their service, and her children and grandchildren walked behind, with their heads held high because they knew that their mother and grandmother had changed the world in ways that would ripple through generations. And so we remembered Josephine Beaulieu now standing at that fence in the darkness before dawn, her basket in her hands, her heart pounding with fear and determination. And we remember the touch of fingers through the wire that connected her to strangers who became brothers, and we remember the German soldier who chose mercy over duty, and we remember the chaos of the liberation when she ran through gunfire to save men she barely knew, and we remember the old woman receiving medals she had never sought for service she had never expected recognition for, and we remember that her story is a story of what one person can do when they decide that something matters more than their own safety, and we remember that as long as we tell her story, she will never truly be gone, and the food she smuggled through the wire will continue to nourish souls, and the courage she showed will continue to inspire hearts, and the love she demonstrated will continue to heal a wounded world, and she will stand forever as proof that even in the darkest chapters of human history, the light of compassion can never be fully extinguished.